Tonight we travel back to the mid-20th century when the sun was slowly setting on British rule in Southeast Asia. Picture it, the warm tropical breeze, the bustling markets, the sound of 1,000 conversations in different languages, all carried by the same colonial power. Malaysia, then a patchwork of British-controlled territories, was a place on the cusp of change. The Brits the rulers were ready to withdraw, but they left a political jigsaw puzzle behind. The question wasn't just who will rule next, it was how do you unite a land with so many voices? Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. All right, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The year is 1945. WT has ended, and with it, the British Empire is starting to show cracks. The colonies that once stretched far and wide were now looking for a way out. And Malaysia. Well, Malaysia had its own plans. It was time to shake off centuries of colonial control, but not just in the way you might think. You see, Malaysia's journey toward independence was more like a complicated tango than a simple leap to freedom. The British hadn't just ruled the land, they'd divided it with Malay states and British settlements living side by side, often at odds. The prospect of unity, a distant dream. The roads to independence weren't clear, and the fight for it was about to get a lot more intricate. But it wasn't just about independence from Britain, it was also about the struggle to forge a new identity. As one historian puts it, the struggle wasn't only against external control, but internal divisions. What made Malaysia so complex was not just its multi-ethnic population, but also its series of tiny fiefdoms, each with its own political interests. How do you unite a land that doesn't want to be united? Historians still debate whether independence could have happened sooner had there been a clearer path for unity. But what we do know is that the 1940s was a tipping point, a time when all the old colonial rule was starting to fray at the edges, and Malaysia would have to find its own way to come together. As the winds of change began to blow through the Malay Peninsula, the idea of unity wasn't something that just appeared overnight. It took time, patience, and a lot of back and forth between people who didn't always see eye to eye. Imagine, if you will, a jigsaw puzzle of Malay states, British colonies and ethnic groups scattered across the land like pieces, each one with a different story to tell. You, as a quiet observer, would notice that not all the pieces fit together easily. Some had been stuck in place for centuries, while others were brand new. No simple matching of edges was going to work. Now let's rewind for a moment and think about the seeds of unity that were planted during this time. In the 1940s, the British were losing their grip on power. The Japanese had invaded and occupied the region during World War II, leaving behind a somewhat unruly legacy. Malaysians, who had lived under the British system of indirect rule, were beginning to see the possibility of self-rule. Even though the British weren't exactly eager to let go of their colonies, they were beginning to realize that keeping their grip too tightly could bring more harm than good. But what about the Malays, the Chinese, and the Indians? Could they form a unified nation despite their many differences? In a place like this, multiculturalism wasn't just a fact of life, it was a tricky puzzle to solve. The Malay leadership wanted to preserve their dominance, while the Chinese population, which had deep ties to trade and commerce, felt marginalized. The Indian community too had a complicated relationship with the British and local leadership. And yet amid these divisions, the realization began to dawn the best way forward might just be to unite these factions under one national banner. A unified independence would be the true test of strength and vision. Historians still argue whether the British, in their own way, encouraged this unity out of strategic necessity. While they were looking to pack their bags and leave, they didn't want to leave behind a fractured, potentially volatile region. Malaysia, they hoped, could be a stable and peaceful place so long as its ethnic groups could find a way to get along. Was that a hope, or simply a British plan to make their exit more graceful? It was 1946 when the British, in their typical fashion, tried something bold and somewhat misguided. They introduced the Malayan Union, a move that would end up stirring more controversy than it ever solved. Imagine it, the British believing that a strong centralized system would help stabilize their post-war empire, decided to impose a single union on the Malay Peninsula. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was one of those plans that worked well on paper, but fell apart once exposed to the heat of local resistance. For the British, the Malayan Union was a way to consolidate power. The idea was that the Malay sultans, long a symbol of local authority, would be under the oversight of a British governor. The plan also intended to extend citizenship to non-Malay communities like the Chinese and Indians, giving them political rights. Now, this might sound fair enough, but the problem lay in the details. The Malay leaders saw this as a direct threat to their sovereignty. To them, it was a blow to their power, and the idea of sharing authority with the British and, importantly, with other ethnic groups was unacceptable. Fast forward a little, and the entire nation, with the exception of the British, was in an uproar. The Malays, united in their opposition, began a concerted campaign against the Malayan Union, something we'd now recognize as a full-blown nationalist movement. The British might have wanted unity, but they couldn't have imagined how forcefully the people would reject it. There were protests, petitions, and even riots, and what was supposed to be a peaceful transition to a united land quickly turned into a bitter struggle. Historians often debate whether this was the key turning point in Malaysia's quest for independence. Was it the Malayan Union that pushed the locals toward greater unity, or did it just drive them to reject foreign rule even more fiercely? While some argue that the Union was doomed from the start, others believe it laid the groundwork for the eventual Federation of Malaya. After all, out of its ashes rose a new sense of identity and unity, one that would help set the stage for independence, albeit after a few more hurdles. After the collapse of the Malayan Union, a new star emerged on the political horizon, Tunku Abdul Rahman. If you were to picture the face of Malaysia's future independence, it would be his unmistakably calm, confident, and determined. Tunku Abdul Rahman was not just a politician, he was the bridge between various factions in Malaysia, and more importantly between the British colonial rulers and a growing sense of national pride among the local Malaysians. In the 1950s, Tunku's political vision became the driving force behind what would later be known as the Alliance Party, a coalition of Malay, Chinese and Indian political groups united in their common goal, independence. But the task ahead was far from simple. Malaysia's ethnic groups were not naturally inclined to trust one another. A century of colonial rule had left its mark. Each community had its own interests, and convincing them to come together for the greater good was a delicate balancing act. But Tunku's charm and diplomatic skills were enough to navigate these treacherous waters. He wasn't about to let the existing divisions tear apart what was becoming an increasingly united political front. He didn't just talk about unity, he lived it, finding ways to bring together leaders from every ethnic group. Under his leadership, the Alliance parties sought to build bridges and create a shared vision for the future. It wasn't about erasing cultural identities. It was about forging a future where Malaysians, no matter their background, could thrive under one government. Historians still argue whether Tunku's personal style, his calm demeanor, and knack for personal diplomacy was the main reason the independence movement succeeded. Some say his role was crucial in bridging the racial divide, while others argue that Malaysia's independence was more a product of global trends than individual leaders. Regardless of where the debate lands, Tunku Abdul Rahman's name is undeniably etched in the nation's foundation. He represented not just a political figure, but a symbol of hope for a country ready to stand on its own 2 feet. By 1957, the pieces were finally starting to fit together. The Federation of Malaya was officially formed, marking the country's first major step toward independence. But let's take a moment to consider what that moment really looked like. Picture the scene. The streets were lined with people of every race, background and belief, all gathered to celebrate the birth of a new nation. The ceremonial signing was an emotional one, though behind the scenes, the negotiations were anything but easy. The Federation's formation wasn't a simple declaration of independence, it was the culmination of years of political maneuvering. Tunku Abdul Rahman had to balance the diverse needs of the Malay majority, the Chinese community, the Indian population, and various other ethnic groups. There was a delicate dance happening between them all. What the leaders were working toward was not just a symbolic independence from Britain, but the creation of a framework that could actually hold together a country that was divided by language, religion, and history. The most significant outcome of the federation was the system of governance it established. It was a constitutional monarchy with the king, the Yang di Pertuan Agong, serving as a ceremonial figurehead. But the real power lay with the elected Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman. The federation also maintained the British practice of dividing the states into a central government and state-level authorities, though the states now had more autonomy than before. But let's not sugarcoat the process too much. There were deep-seated issues to resolve. The Chinese community had significant influence over the economy and didn't always see eye to eye with the Malay-dominated government, especially on matters of citizenship and political rights. The Indian population had concerns of their own, namely about being included in the political process and not being sidelined by the dominant Malay faction. Historians are still divided on whether the federation truly represented the beginning of harmony or simply papered over the cracks that would eventually become more pronounced in the years to come. Some view the federation as a moment of triumph, where the various communities achieved a delicate balance, while others see it as a compromise that postponed deeper conflicts that would surface later. As the Federation of Malaya took its first steps toward independence, it wasn't long before it encountered its first major internal challenge, the communist insurgency. Imagine this moment: the new nation, fresh from the euphoria of independence, suddenly faced a threat from within. A growing communist movement fueled by the remnants of wartime resistance and ideological fervor threatened the delicate peace that had been so hard won. In the post-war years, the Malayan Communist Party MCP was gaining momentum. Many of the communist fighters had been celebrated heroes during the Japanese occupation, but as the British withdrew and the new government began consolidating power, the MCP found itself in opposition to the Federation. Their goal, a communist revolution that would overthrow the government. In 1948, the British declared a state of emergency in response to the communist insurgency, and this emergency was inherited by the Federation of Malaya upon its independence. For the young country, this was a massive test. While the communists enjoyed some local support, especially from Chinese communities, the Federation's government under Tunku Abdul Rahman was determined to maintain order and stability. This was no easy feat, as Malaysia's multi-ethnic society was ripe for division. The communists were also able to tap into economic grievances, which made it all the more difficult to root them out. The Communist Party wasn't just an ideological movement. It had supporters who saw it as the only way to address the poverty and inequality faced by the rural poor. Historians still argue whether the threat from the communist insurgency was truly quelled, or if it simply shifted into more subtle forms of resistance. Some believe the emergency laws and military response stifled communist activity, while others argue that the issue was never fully resolved and would resurface in different forms. What's undeniable is that the communist insurgency profoundly affected the Federation's early years, shaping the political environment and solidifying Tunku Abdul Rahman's leadership. As the dust of the Malayan emergency began to settle, Malaysia's leaders turned their attention to a new, exciting chapter: the inclusion of Singapore into the Federation. It was the early 1960s, and the vision of a greater Malaysia was gaining traction. Singapore, a bustling port city with a thriving economy, seemed like the perfect addition to the newly formed federation. After all, it was a natural fit geographically, culturally, and economically. However, this inclusion wasn't as simple as it seemed. Let's picture Singapore at this time, a tiny, vibrant island nation with a rich, diverse population of Chinese, Malays, and Indians. Economically, it was thriving, yet politically it was still grappling with its own identity. Singapore had long been a British colony and had gained self-governance just a few years earlier, in 1959. By the early 1960s, Singapore was ready to take the next step and join the Federation of Malaya to create a larger, more powerful entity. The idea was that together they could combine their resources and strength to form a more unified and prosperous region. But here's where things got complicated. Singapore's political scene was far from unified. The ruling People's Action Party (PAP), led by Lee Kuan Yew, was aligned with the Malay leadership in many ways, but it also had a more left-leaning populist approach. This clash of ideologies mixed with the underlying ethnic tensions set the stage for a series of difficult negotiations. Tunku Abdul Rahman, ever the diplomat, was initially open to the idea of Singapore joining, but he and other Malay leaders were wary of the growing influence of the Chinese-dominated PAP in Singapore. There were concerns about how this would affect the delicate balance of power in the Federation. Historians still debate whether the inclusion of Singapore was a necessary step for Malaysia's development or whether it was a mistake that set the stage for future tensions. Was it a pragmatic move to strengthen the region, or did it sow the seeds for the eventual split in 1965? The short-lived union between Singapore and the Federation was ultimately doomed by political infighting, ethnic divisions, and a lack of common ground on key issues. By 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia and became an independent city-state. The question remains, could Malaysia and Singapore have made it work if they had better political cohesion, or was the split inevitable given the differences between the two? In the wake of Singapore's departure from the Federation, Malaysia's leaders were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered vision. The loss of Singapore was a blow, but it also presented an opportunity for Malaysia to reframe its future without the challenges posed by its small island neighbour. With Singapore out of the picture, Malaysia's leaders began to focus on what was truly essential for the nation's long-term stability. This shift in focus brought Sabah and Sarawak into the fold, two territories that were to become integral parts of Malaysia's larger identity. Now let's travel a little further west and picture the Borneo states, Sabah and Sarawak, vast territories of tropical rainforest, rich cultures, and diverse ethnic communities. These states were far from the Malay heartland. Historically, they had been British colonies as well, but they were much more removed from the political turbulence of the peninsula. Their inclusion into the Federation of Malaysia was not just about geography, but also about ensuring that the Federation maintained regional strength. The idea was simple: Sabah and Sarawak would lend Malaysia valuable natural resources, especially timber and oil, while benefiting from the economic and political stability that the Federation offered. However, the path to inclusion was far from smooth. Sabah and Sarawak had their own distinct identities, and many locals felt that joining the Federation might dilute their autonomy. The British had maintained a degree of independence for these territories, and there was concern that Malaysia's central government might impose policies that didn't take local needs into account. This uncertainty led to negotiations that took time and effort. The Borneo states weren't just joining a new country, they were making a significant leap into a new political order with their unique interests to preserve. Historians still argue whether Malaysia's rapid expansion into Borneo was as smooth as it appeared, or if it concealed lingering resentment and distrust. Some view the inclusion of Sabah and Sarawak as a necessary step to secure Malaysia's economic future, while others believe the government was too quick to push them into a union that didn't fully respect their local autonomy. What's certain is that this expansion brought Malaysia new opportunities and challenges, with a wider range of voices contributing to the national conversation. But the question remains, were Sabah and Sarawak truly integrated into Malaysia, or were they simply added on to a federation that wasn't fully equipped to manage their distinct needs? Now that the federation was taking shape with the inclusion of Sabah and Sarawak, Malaysia began to face its biggest challenge, yet managing its complex multi-ethnic population. You, as an observer, would notice that Malaysia wasn't just a geographical entity. It was a living mosaic of cultures, languages, religions, and traditions. The Malay majority, with its strong cultural and political influence, had to balance the aspirations of the Chinese and Indian communities, who had long been integral to the country's economy but often felt marginalized in the political process. The nation's leadership faced a crucial task, ensuring that the diversity of Malaysia's people could coexist peacefully in a country that was still finding its footing. The political leaders had to be diplomats, negotiators, and visionaries, but they also had to contend with the deep-rooted economic disparities and the fear that one group might dominate the others. There were intense debates over economic policies, citizenship rights, and political representation. The most challenging issue was how to reconcile the needs of a rapidly urbanizing Chinese community with the traditional rural Malay population. One of the landmark policies that emerged during this time was the new economic policy NEP introduced in 1971. The NEP was designed to reduce poverty and promote equitable wealth distribution, but it also aimed to address the issue of ethnic inequality, particularly the disparities between the Malays and the Chinese. The policy included affirmative action measures that favored the Malay community in areas such as education, business, and civil service positions. While the NEP helped to uplift the Malay population economically, it also sparked ongoing debates about the fairness of such policies. Historians still debate the long-term impact of the NEP on Malaysia's social and political landscape. Was it a necessary move to address systemic inequality, or did it inadvertently deepen ethnic divisions in the long run? While some see it as a stepping stone toward a more balanced society, others argue that it created a sense of resentment among the non-Malay communities, particularly the Chinese, who felt that their contributions to the country were being overlooked. The debate continues to this day, reflecting the tension between unity and diversity that remains a hallmark of Malaysia's political culture. As Malaysia entered the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it became clear that the country had undergone a remarkable transformation. What had once been a collection of diverse, often divided territories had slowly evolved into a relatively unified nation-state, overcoming decades of political, ethnic, and economic challenges. But this progress didn't come without its scars. The Malaysia of today is shaped by both its successes and its ongoing struggles with its multi-ethnic identity, regional disparities, and political tensions. Looking back, it's easy to see that Malaysia's journey toward becoming the nation it is today wasn't just a matter of independence from British rule, it was about negotiating its identity in a world that was rapidly changing. The inclusion of Sabah and Sarawak, the tension with Singapore, the uneasy balance between the Malays, Chinese Indians, and indigenous communities, these were all milestones that defined the Malaysian story. And yet, despite the trials, Malaysia has managed to keep itself together in ways many other nations born out of colonial rule could not. But history, as we know, is never static. The challenges faced by Malaysia today, corruption scandals, economic inequality, and the rise of new political ideologies are simply the latest chapter in the long story of a country finding its place in the world. The dream of a united, equitable Malaysia remains elusive for some, while for others, it's a reality worth holding on to. As you settle into this story of Malaysia's evolution, there's a sense of both accomplishment and introspection. The nation that emerged from the shadow of British colonialism isn't perfect, but it has been shaped by an incredible resilience, a determination to keep pushing forward despite the obstacles. And maybe, just maybe, that's the very essence of what it means to be a nation. So take a deep breath, let the imagery of Malaysia's transformation wash over you, and let it remind you of the beauty and complexity of nations, of how they rise, fall, and ultimately find their way to something greater. Perhaps in some small way, this history of Malaysia's federation mirrors the quiet, steady progression of our own lives with all their ups and downs. Now, as the echoes of Malaysia's journey fade into the night, take a moment to let everything settle in. Close your eyes and imagine the quiet, peaceful landscape of Malaysia with its lush jungles, busy cities, and gentle coastal breezes. Picture the calm and steady progress of a nation that has faced adversity with grace, always striving to build something better for its people. As you reflect on the history we've just shared, remember that nations, like individuals, take time to grow and change, shaped by the winds of history and the hearts of those who believe in the possibility of something more. So as the story of Malaysia's federation comes to a close, let the gentle hum of the world around you remind you that just like this nation, your own journey continues. Slowly, peacefully take comfort in the idea that everything has a way of finding its place in time. Let go of any remaining thoughts of the day, and with each breath, allow your mind to drift gently into rest.